So the mind is basically a grasping instrument. It is like one of those claws that you see in those old school machines at arcades or fairs, where it's a kind of mechanical claw which you can try to use to grab a toy, but of course it's really, really, really hard to actually get the claw on the toy in time. And the mind is a little bit similar this way, because even if you can grasp something, it quickly falls out effectively, and you need something else, and so there's a cycle of seeking happiness that comes from identification with the person, and the mind is looking to grasp objects as a way to get to its happiness, or to avoid unhappiness, which really comes to the same thing. This is also true with explanation, intellectual explanation, intellectual understanding of anything. It's about grasping things. And it is true with the spiritual search itself. That is to say, in all cases, the mind is really trying to grasp something. But the hidden secret behind these things, behind, regular happiness, behind grasping in terms of explanation, philosophical explanation, or in terms of spiritual explanation, is that as with the claw in the arcade machine, the only winning move is not to play. The actual state of happiness that we're seeking in the spiritual realm is the state when the mind is not attempting to grasp. That's the state of happiness. That's the state of existential or spiritual true understanding. The philosophical quest for existential questions is satisfied when the mind ceases to grasp. And this is, in a sense, the purpose of surrender and self-inquiry. It's to stop the identity-based habits of the mind that seek to grasp, because the mind is identifying with a limited entity. The person basically wants things and gets them by grasping. And it also sees everything in terms of objects, which is, the subject-object vision it has, which is, I'm seeing everything in terms of limited objects. When I'm looking in self-inquiry or surrender even, the whole problem, in a way, is the mind cannot conceive of what isn't a graspable object. So when in inquiry you're looking for yourself, the problem is you're looking for an object. What you actually are is not an object. You are the fact of not grasping. You are the fact of non-looking, in a sense. You are that which is when the mind is not grasping. But it has to be taken with a certain caveat, which is that when the mind merely doesn't grasp for a second, which can happen in many states, right? It can happen as a result of self-inquiry or surrender, but it can also happen as a result of zoning out. It can happen as a result of all kinds of pleasures or shocks or things like that. If it happens merely quote-unquote casually, temporarily, then there isn't associated with that the recognition that this non-grasping is what you are all the time. Instead what happens is the non-grasping becomes itself a kind of state which comes into existence and then goes out of existence. And as such, it becomes merely the thought of non-grasping. It itself becomes a grasped object as a memory. Which is why when you're doing self-inquiry or surrender and you get to states of peace or blankness or nothingness, or you can describe them many different ways, they may seem temporarily blissful, but they're insufficient. Why? Because the bliss is coming and going. It hasn't been recognized to be your fundamental nature. The non-grasping of the mind is not just a state. It is the permanent fact of the self. The self is always non-grasping. The self is always in a position of not possessing things in that limited way. There's only the thought of grasping. Even that, who grasps that thought? There is, therefore, a kind of interesting dynamic, because the seeker is trying to practice the seeker is trying to practice non-grasping. And the idea of the practice is sort of twofold in purpose. The first is, and they're related, the first is to practice non-grasping in a relative sense in order to acquaint yourself with a kind of inner peace. That inner peace that you're acquainting yourself with is a temporary inner peace, but it increases because what happens is through inquiry or surrender, you start to encounter the joy of non-grasping. When you seek yourself or you ignore thought, these come to the same thing, you automatically go into various states of non-grasping. Those states of non-grasping are associated with peace. The peace that you get from inner work starts to supplant the peace that is sought through external objects. This weakens the reliance on external objects as sources of happiness. And that in turn weakens the sense of identification with the person, because the person is a kind of illusion or artifact of the mind jumping between external objects. So as that carousel motion decreases, the illusion that is caused by the carousel moving like that, which is the same as the illusion of like a flip book as you flip, and it seems to create motion, or a movie, which is, frames creating motion, something similar, analogous, right? So as the motion of the thought slows down, the illusion of identification slows down. As the illusion of identification slows down, you get to the second purpose of the practice, which is to recognize that the states of peace or non-grasping are actually reflections of something which is permanent and unchanging. That second piece happens when the carousel slows down enough and the illusion of identification drops out. If it drops out temporarily, you get what's called a glimpse. If it drops out permanently, quote unquote, then there's the final recognition, whatever that means. I'm simplifying because the truth is the final recognition is there is no final recognition. It is both is and isn't the case, because that recognition involves the fact that this has always been the case. Knowledge has always been the case. Ignorance has never been the case. So therefore there can't be a final recognition, because ignorance is never the case. Then how can you have a final recognition, a final destruction of an ignorance that wasn't the case? You can't, actually. So there's a bit of a paradox. The mind can't grasp. So the mind is practicing non-grasping, but it also can't just not grasp and leave it there, because every moment it gets into that non-grasping, even for a second, is merely a state. It is, first of all, vulnerable to attack by the remaining attachments of the mind, which come and try to, abduct the mind from its non-grasping state back into a grasping state. And secondly, it doesn't really reflect the true nature of the self, which is not about a specific state of peace, but about the peace that is always there, even in the seeming states of grasping. Because the seeming states of grasping are themselves merely thoughts, and they are thoughts that afflict an imaginary person. Whereas a self which does not grasp those thoughts cannot be affected by those thoughts. So there's nobody who's actually affected by those thoughts. The idea of someone affected by those thoughts is itself part of the illusion. All of this is seen through essentially the practice of non-grasping, which is both surrender and inquiry. But the problem, again, to note and to clarify, is that this non-grasping can be very subtle. It has to be very subtle, because a state of non-grasping, if it is accepted as the final thing, when in fact it's something that comes and goes, is itself an object that is grasped. It's just a very subtle object that's grasped. Just like the state of deep sleep is a kind of non-grasping state, but it comes and goes. So the ignorance, which is identification born of attachments, is not destroyed. But fundamentally, what you're looking for is non-grasping. So in inquiry, for example, the mind is trying to see itself. It's confused about what it is, basically, and it's looking for itself. But what it actually is can't be grasped, can't be seen, can't be thought, can't be heard, can't be imagined, can't be remembered. It's like a camera lens, one of those old school cameras where you have to kind of like press the button slightly to focus it. What we're looking for here is the defocused state. It's like a muscle in your body which is trying to contract around something, but what you're looking for is not anything to contract around. It's not to get any particular thing, but to relax. But if you merely relax, then you will simply fall back into the habits of usual attachment. So the true non-grasping can only be achieved through a rigorously guarded process of inculcating a non-grasping mentality that first destroys the usual grasping at a relative level, that is to say, in a coming and going way, increasingly peace from the inner, decreasingly peace from the outer. And that eventually results in the lake of the mind stilling sufficiently that you look into it and recognize, this inner peace that I've been cultivating in this gradual way is actually just nothing other than me, as I have always been, and could never not be, so to say. This non-grasping truth behind things is why the spacious mind, as I call it, which is the nature of a glimpse, is that sense of what you thought was inside, which is to say, what you thought was this I that you're trying to grasp, actually is outside. Meaning that what you thought was you is actually on the inside of what's actually you. What you were trying to grasp as a kind of atomic core, actually, it grasps you. And so when you relax sufficiently, but in a kind of systematic way, so as to defeat the usual pulls back into grasping, it is suddenly seen that what you're looking for can't be seen. But it is all-encompassing. It is known as the unseeable, that you know directly as the unseeable. You cannot see it, but you know it as that which cannot be seen, that which cannot be grasped.